Millionaire Falls for his contract wife, their unexpected love story. Shocks everyone. The sharp clang of a bell above the door announced another customer at Bennett's diner. Claire Bennett didn't look up immediately, her hands busy scrubbing a stubborn coffee stain from the counter. The familiar hum of the diner, clinking cutlery, murmured conversations, and the occasional burst of laughter had always been her comfort, but lately it felt like a weight pressing on her shoulders. The numbers didn't lie. The diner was losing money faster than she could patch the holes. She straightened, pushing a loose strand of hair out of her face, and turned to greet the newcomer. Her smile faltered when she realized it wasn't a customer. It was Alan, the landlord, his expression as sour as the coffee he always complained about. "Claire," he began, his tone heavy with forced politeness, "we need to talk." Alan slid into one of the booths, and Claire joined him reluctantly, wiping her hands on her apron. She didn't need to hear what he was going to say. She already knew. The unpaid bills, the overdue rent. It was a song she had heard on repeat for months now. "You're behind again," Alan said bluntly, placing a folded sheet of paper on the table. 2 months, and I can't keep holding off." "You know I've been patient." "I know," Claire said quickly, her voice trembling. "I'm trying, Alan. Business has been slow, but things will pick up. They always do." Alan sighed, his gaze softening slightly. "I like you, Claire. Your dad was a good man, and I want to see you succeed. But I can't keep taking a hit on this place. If you can't pay by the end of the month, I'm going to have to find another tenant." Claire's heart sank. "The end of the month," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's just 2 weeks away." "I'm sorry," Alan said, his tone sincere. But his apology couldn't change the reality of her situation. As Alan left, Claire sat frozen in the booth, staring at the paper he had left behind. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, the bold numbers confirming what she already knew, $12,000 in overdue rent. It might as well have been $1 million. Her brother, Sam, walked in from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. He frowned when he saw her expression. "What's wrong?" "Alan was here," Claire said, her voice hollow. "We have 2 weeks to pay him, or we're out." Sam's face fell. 2 weeks? That's impossible. How are we supposed to come up with that kind of money? "I don't know," Claire admitted, her chest tightening. "But we have to. This place is all we have left of Dad." Sam nodded, his jaw set. "We'll figure something out. We always do." But Claire wasn't so sure. The weight of responsibility bore down on her, threatening to crush her under its relentless pressure. Later that evening, after the diner had closed and Sam had gone home, Claire stayed behind to balance the books. She sat at the counter, her eyes burning from staring at the numbers, each one a reminder of her failure. The bell above the door rang, startling her. She looked up to see a man step inside. He was tall and impeccably dressed, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the diner's humble decor. His sharp features were framed by neatly combed dark hair, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to take in everything with calculated precision. "We're closed," Claire said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I know," the man replied, his voice smooth and confident. "But I'm not here for food." She frowned, crossing her arms. "Then what do you want?" He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "My name is Ethan Monroe. I have a business proposition for you." Claire's brow furrowed. "If you're here to offer me a loan, save it. I'm not interested in charity." "It's not charity," Ethan said, his tone cool. "It's an arrangement, one that could solve your financial problems and help me with mine." Claire's skepticism deepened. "I don't know who you are, but I'm not in the habit of making deals with strangers." Ethan smirked faintly, pulling a business card from his pocket and placing it on the counter. "Then take the time to get to know me. Call me tomorrow, and I'll explain everything." He turned and walked out, leaving Claire staring after him. She picked up the card, reading the embossed lettering. Ethan Monroe, CEO, Monroe Enterprises. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't place it. The next day, curiosity got the better of her. Between serving customers, she searched his name online. The results were staggering. Ethan Monroe was one of New York's most prominent real estate moguls, known for his sharp business acumen and ruthless ambition. But why would a man like him be interested in someone like her? That evening, after much deliberation, Claire called the number on the card. Ethan answered almost immediately, his voice as composed as ever. "I didn't think you'd call," he said. "I'm calling to hear you out," Claire replied. "That's all." "Fair enough," Ethan said. "Can you meet me tomorrow at my office?" "Noon." Claire hesitated, but eventually agreed. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far bigger than herself, but desperation left her little choice. The following day, Claire found herself in Ethan's sleek office, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Ethan sat behind a massive desk, his demeanor calm but commanding. "I'll get straight to the point," Ethan said. "I need a wife." Claire blinked, certain she had misheard. "Excuse me?" "A contract wife," he clarified. "It's a temporary arrangement, 1 year. You help me secure a merger by appearing to be my stable, grounded partner, and in return I'll pay you enough to save your diner and cover your debts." Claire stared at him, her mind racing. "You want me to pretend to be your wife? Why me?" "You're exactly what I need," Ethan said. "You're smart, independent, and not part of the socialite world I'm trying to distance myself from. You'll make me look authentic." "And what's in it for me?" Claire asked, her tone sharp. "Financial security," Ethan said simply. "I can save your diner, Claire, but only if you agree." As Claire walked out of his office, the weight of his offer pressed heavily on her. The deal was absurd, but so was her situation. She had 2 weeks to decide, knowing that whatever choice she made would change her life forever. The sun had set by the time Claire returned to the diner. She walked through the empty dining room, the once comforting space now cloaked in shadows. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, and it seemed louder than usual, like a reminder of the silence her life had fallen into. She sat at her father's old desk in the cramped office, the scent of coffee and grease still clinging to the walls. The folder Ethan had handed her during their meeting lay unopened on the desk, the weight of its contents heavier than she cared to admit. Claire's thoughts swirled as she stared at the folder. Ethan's proposal felt ridiculous, preposterous even, but the desperation in her chest whispered otherwise. 2 weeks. That was all she had to save the diner and secure Sam's future. The stakes couldn't have been higher. She opened the folder with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the neatly typed contract. The terms were straightforward, yet surreal. 1 year of marriage, public appearances as Ethan's wife, and a carefully crafted narrative to satisfy his business associates. In return, she would receive a sum large enough to pay off the diner's debts and keep it running comfortably for years. A knock on the office door pulled her from her thoughts. Sam peeked his head in, his face etched with concern. "You've been quiet all night," he said, stepping inside. "Everything okay?" Claire closed the folder quickly, shoving it aside. "I'm fine, just tired." Sam didn't buy it, his sharp eyes narrowing. "Come on, Claire, I know you. Something's up." She hesitated, unsure how much to share. Finally, she sighed, leaning back in the chair. "What would you do if someone offered you a way to fix everything but—" It came with strings attached. Sam raised an eyebrow, sitting on the edge of the desk. "What kind of strings?" "Big ones," Claire said, avoiding his gaze. "Like life-changing strings." Sam studied her for a moment before answering. "I'd ask myself if the risk is worth it. If what I'm giving up is more than what I'm gaining." His words settled heavily in her chest. Was she giving up too much by agreeing to Ethan's deal, or was she saving what mattered most? The following morning, Claire stood outside Ethan's office building, the sleek glass facade reflecting the bustling city around her. She clutched the contract in her hands, her heart pounding. She hadn't called ahead. She wasn't even sure she'd go through with this. But her feet had carried her here, as if her subconscious had already decided. The receptionist greeted her with a polite smile, leading her to Ethan's office. When the door opened, Ethan was seated behind his massive desk, his focus fixed on a stack of papers. He looked up when she entered, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers.
"Claire," he said, setting the papers aside, "I didn't expect to see you so soon." She stepped forward, placing the folder on his desk. "I've been thinking about your offer." Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable.
"And?" "I'll do it," Claire said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. "But I have a few conditions." Ethan's eyebrow arched, intrigued. "Conditions?" Claire nodded, folding her arms. "First, this stays strictly professional. No surprises, no complications." "Agreed," Ethan said smoothly. "What else?" "I won't lie about my family," she continued. "If anyone asks, I'll tell them the truth about why I'm doing this." Ethan tilted his head, considering. "Fair enough." "And finally," Claire said, her gaze hardening, "if this gets too messy, if it starts to hurt my brother or the diner, I walk away, no matter what." A faint smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "You drive a hard bargain." "I have to," Claire replied, her voice firm. "This is my life we're talking about." Ethan extended his hand, his expression serious now. "Then we have a deal." Claire hesitated for only a moment before shaking his hand. The warmth of his palm startled her, but she quickly pulled away, her resolve unwavering. By the end of the week, Claire had moved into Ethan's penthouse. The transition was jarring, her modest apartment above the diner replaced by sleek marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an unobstructed view of the city skyline. It was the kind of luxury she had only seen in magazines, but it felt cold, almost sterile. Ethan gave her a brief tour, his tone businesslike. "You'll have your own room, of course. We'll attend our first public event together next weekend. Until then, familiarize yourself with the details in the packet I've provided." "Details?" Claire asked, frowning. "Our backstory," Ethan clarified. "How we met, how we fell in love, everything they'll expect to hear." Claire bit back a sharp retort, reminding herself why she was here. "Got it." As Ethan turned to leave, Claire called after him. "This doesn't feel real." He paused, glancing over his shoulder. "It will soon enough." The days that followed were a blur of adjustments and rehearsals. Claire spent hours memorizing their fabricated story, practicing the right answers to expected questions. Ethan remained distant but professional, his focus on ensuring their facade was flawless. One evening, as Claire sat on the penthouse balcony reviewing the script, Ethan joined her, a glass of scotch in his hand. For a moment, they sat in silence, the city lights stretching out before them. "Why are you really doing this?" Claire asked, her voice cutting through the quiet. "What's so important that you'd go to these lengths?" Ethan's jaw tightened, and for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Because I've spent my life building something that can't afford to fail, and this merger, it's the final piece." Claire studied him, her skepticism softening. "You sound like someone who's been running for a long time." Ethan turned to her, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Maybe I am, but that doesn't mean I'm going to stop." Claire nodded, the weight of his words settling between them. They were both running, from different things perhaps, but running nonetheless. And for better or worse, they were in this together now. Claire awoke to the soft hum of the city outside the penthouse windows. The morning light filtered through sheer curtains, casting golden rays across the sleek, minimalist room. She sat up slowly, taking in her surroundings, so different from the cozy, cluttered space above the diner. This place felt vast, pristine and cold, much like the man whose name she now shared. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a reminder for her first public appearance with Ethan that evening, a gala hosted by one of his most prominent business partners. The thought sent a ripple of anxiety through her chest. She had been practicing their fabricated story all week, but the idea of facing a room full of skeptical socialites felt like stepping into a lion's den. Later that morning, Claire found Ethan in his office, seated behind an imposing desk that matched the rest of the penthouse's opulence. Papers were spread out before him, and he barely glanced up as she entered. "You're up early," Ethan remarked, his tone neutral. "Couldn't sleep," Claire replied, taking a seat across from him. She hesitated before adding, "Tonight's event, what should I expect?" Ethan finally looked at her, his piercing blue eyes scanning her face. "It's straightforward. We'll arrive together, make the rounds, and stick to the script. They'll ask questions: how we met, how long we've been together, what drew us to each other. Keep your answers brief, but convincing." "Brief but convincing," Claire repeated, the words heavy on her tongue. "Got it." "And one more thing," Ethan said, leaning forward. "Vivian will be there." Claire's stomach tightened. "Your mother?" "Yes," Ethan said, his expression darkening slightly. "She's not a fan of unconventional arrangements. She'll be watching you closely." Claire swallowed hard, her mind racing. "Anything else I should know?" Ethan's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "She'll try to intimidate you. Don't let her." By early evening, Claire stood in front of a full-length mirror, examining her reflection. The emerald green gown Ethan's assistant had chosen for her clung to her figure in all the right places, the fabric shimmering under the soft light. A matching necklace adorned her neck, its elegance far beyond anything she had ever worn before. Sam's voice echoed in her mind. "What are you giving up to gain all this?" She pushed the thought aside as Ethan appeared in the doorway, dressed in a tailored black suit. His gaze swept over her, and for a fleeting moment his usual cool demeanor softened. "You clean up well," he said, his tone almost teasing. "So do you," Claire replied, trying to mask her nervousness. Ethan extended his arm, and after a brief hesitation, she took it. As they stepped into the elevator, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a storm. The ballroom was a masterpiece of extravagance. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, and waitstaff in crisp uniforms moved seamlessly through the crowd. The hum of conversation and clinking glasses filled the air as the city's elite mingled in their finest attire. Claire clung to Ethan's arm as they entered, her heart pounding. All eyes seemed to turn toward them, the weight of their gazes like a spotlight. Ethan leaned down slightly, his voice low and steady. "Relax. You've got this." She nodded, her fingers tightening around his arm. The first hour passed in a blur of introductions and polite conversation. Ethan was the consummate host, effortlessly navigating the crowd and deflecting questions with charm and precision. But Claire felt the scrutiny. She caught the skeptical glances, the whispered comments, the way some of the women sized her up with thinly veiled disdain. The pressure was suffocating, but she forced herself to smile, to play the role Ethan needed her to. Just as Claire began to find her footing, a familiar figure appeared in the crowd. Vivian Munro was every bit as imposing as Ethan had described. Her sharp features accentuated by a flawless black dress, her movements precise and deliberate. She approached them with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ethan," Vivian said, kissing her son's cheek, always the picture of composure. "Mother," Ethan replied, his tone polite but distant. Vivian turned her attention to Claire, her gaze piercing. "And you must be Claire. I've heard so much about you." Claire's stomach churned, but she extended her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Munro." "Likewise," Vivian said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Tell me, Claire, how does it feel to step into a world so different from your own?" The question was laced with condescension, but Claire held her ground. "It's certainly an adjustment, but I'm learning quickly." Vivian's smile tightened. "I'm sure you are," Ethan intervened, his voice firm. "Mother, perhaps this isn't the time for an interrogation." "Of course," Vivian said smoothly. "Forgive me. I'm simply curious about the woman who's captured my son's attention." As Vivian moved away, Ethan turned to Claire, his jaw clenched. "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be," Claire said, her voice steady. "I can handle her." As the evening wore on, Claire found herself in a conversation with one of Ethan's business associates, an older man named Mr. Calloway. He was charming and warm, asking her questions about her background and interests. For the first time that evening, Claire felt at ease. But as she spoke, she caught sight of Chloe Daniels standing nearby, her eyes fixed on them with thinly veiled contempt. Chloe approached as Mr. Calloway excused himself, her tone saccharine. "You must be Claire," Chloe said, her smile sharp. "Ethan's new project." Claire stiffened, her instincts warning her to tread carefully. "And you must be Chloe. Ethan's colleague?" Chloe's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Colleague, friend, confidant, we go way back. I just wanted to offer some advice. This world isn't kind to outsiders. You'll need more than charm to survive here." Claire met Chloe's gaze, her voice firm. "Thanks for the advice, but I think I'll be fine." As Chloe walked away, Claire's confidence faltered. The weight of the evening pressed down on her, and she slipped outside for a moment to catch her breath. Ethan found her on the terrace, the cool night air a welcome reprieve from the stifling atmosphere inside. He approached quietly, his expression softer than she had ever seen. "You held your own tonight," he said, leaning on the railing beside her. "Barely," Claire replied, her voice laced with exhaustion. "Your world is, intense." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "It is, but you handled it better than most." They stood in silence for a moment, the city lights stretching out before them. For the first time, Claire felt a glimmer of understanding between them. Two people navigating a world that demanded more than either of them was willing to give. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Claire admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can," Ethan said, his voice steady. "You're stronger than you think." For a brief moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink, the barriers they had built cracking under the weight of shared vulnerability. But just as quickly, the moment passed, leaving them both questioning what lay ahead. Claire woke the morning after the gala with an ache in her chest, the weight of the previous evening pressing down on her. The penthouse was quiet, its stillness amplifying the whirlwind of emotions she had suppressed the night before. She sat at the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the large mirror across the room. The woman looking back at her seemed out of place, dressed in borrowed elegance and wearing a mask she barely recognized. The smell of freshly brewed coffee drew her to the kitchen, where Ethan stood by the counter, scrolling through his phone. He was already impeccably dressed, his tie perfectly knotted, and his demeanor as composed as ever. "You're up early," Ethan remarked, not looking up from his phone. "Couldn't sleep," Claire replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. The tension from the gala lingered between them, unspoken but palpable. Ethan finally set his phone down, his gaze softening slightly. "You did well last night." Claire let out a humorless laugh, her fingers tightening around the mug. "Did I? Your mother practically dissected me in front of half the room, and Chloe made it clear that she doesn't think I belong." Ethan's jaw tightened, a flicker of guilt crossing his face. "Vivian and Chloe are difficult, but their opinions don't matter. What matters is that the board believed us." "That's easy for you to say," Claire shot back, her voice sharp. "You've been playing this game your whole life. I'm just trying to survive it." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but closed it again, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unresolved tension. Later that afternoon, as Claire tried to lose herself in the contract backstory she had memorized a dozen times, the doorbell rang. She opened the door to find Vivian standing there, her sharp eyes scanning the penthouse with calculated precision. "Mrs. Munro," Claire said, her voice stiff. "I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," Vivian replied, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I thought it was time we had a little chat, woman to woman." Claire's stomach churned as she followed Vivian into the living room. The older woman sat with the poise of someone used to commanding attention, her gaze cutting through any pretense. "I'll get straight to the point," Vivian began, her tone cool. "I don't believe for a second that this arrangement between you and Ethan is genuine." Claire's heart raced, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, come now," Vivian said, her lips curving into a faint smirk. "You may have fooled his business associates, but you haven't fooled me. I know my son, and I know this isn't real." Claire bristled at Vivian's arrogance, but kept her voice steady. "If you know Ethan so well, then you should know he doesn't do anything without a reason. If he chose me, there's a reason for that." Vivian's smile faltered, but her gaze remained piercing. "You're clever, I'll give you that. But cleverness won't be enough to survive in our world. You're in over your head, Claire, and when this falls apart, and it will, I hope you're prepared for the consequences." With that, Vivian rose gracefully and walked to the door. "Consider this a friendly warning," she said before leaving, the click of her heels echoing in the silence. Vivian's words lingered long after she was gone, gnawing at Claire's confidence. That evening, as she stood on the penthouse balcony, the city lights stretching out before her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win. Ethan joined her, his presence announced by the faint creak of the balcony door. He stood beside her, his hands resting on the railing, the tension in his posture mirroring her own. "Vivian came by," Claire said, breaking the silence. "She's not exactly subtle." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll talk to her." "No," Claire said quickly, her voice firm. "This is between her and me. She doesn't think I belong here, and maybe she's right." Ethan turned to face her, his expression uncharacteristically vulnerable. "She's not right. Don't let her get in your head." Claire met his gaze, her emotions swirling. "Why do you care so much? This is just a contract, remember?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Because you're doing more than I ever expected. You're standing up to people who've spent their lives tearing others down. That's not easy." His words caught her off guard, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to shrink. But Claire quickly looked away, the weight of their situation pulling her back to reality. The next day, Claire accompanied Ethan to a business meeting with the board of directors. The room was filled with stern faces and cold stares, their skepticism palpable. As Ethan presented his latest proposal for the merger, Claire sat silently beside him, feeling like a decorative piece rather than a partner. But then one of the board members, a man named Howard Green, directed a question at her. "Claire, as Ethan's wife, what's your perspective on his vision for the future of Monroe Enterprises?" The question caught her off guard, and she hesitated, the room's attention shifting to her. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I think Ethan's vision is ambitious," Claire began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "But ambition alone isn't enough. Success comes from understanding the people who make it possible, from the employees to the clients. And that's something Ethan has always valued." Her words hung in the air, the room falling silent. Howard nodded thoughtfully, and the conversation shifted back to the business at hand. But Claire could feel the weight of Ethan's gaze on her, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. As they left the meeting, Ethan stopped her in the hallway, his voice low. "What you said in there, that wasn't in the script." Claire met his gaze, her chin lifted defiantly. "It's what I believe. Isn't that what they wanted to hear?" Ethan's lips twitched into a faint smile. "You're full of surprises." Claire shrugged, masking the small flutter in her chest. "You hired me for authenticity, remember?" As they stepped into the elevator, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. The cracks in their carefully constructed facade were growing, and with them came a connection neither of them had anticipated. The elevator's smooth descent seemed to stretch into eternity. Claire could feel Ethan's eyes on her, their earlier exchange in the boardroom lingering between them like an unfinished conversation. When the elevator doors opened to the lobby, she stepped out quickly, her heels clicking against the marble floor, determined to keep some distance. Ethan matched her pace, his longer strides effortlessly catching up to her. "Claire," he said softly, just loud enough to halt her retreat. She stopped but didn't turn, her body tense. "What is it?" "You were incredible in there," Ethan said, his voice sincere. "They were impressed." Claire turned to face him, her expression a mix of defiance and uncertainty. "I wasn't trying to impress them. I just said what I felt." "And that's exactly what made an impact," Ethan replied, his gaze steady. "Most people say what they think others want to hear. You didn't." The compliment caught Claire off guard, and she felt her defenses waver. "It's not always easy to speak your mind when people are looking for reasons to doubt you." Ethan nodded, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. "I know the feeling." Back at the penthouse, Claire changed into more comfortable clothes, relieved to shed the armor of her public persona. She was pouring herself a glass of water in the kitchen when Ethan walked in, his tie loosened and his jacket slung over one arm. He looked more approachable, less like the powerful CEO, and more like the man she glimpsed in unguarded moments. "I was thinking," Ethan began, leaning against the counter, "the merger's moving forward faster than expected. There's a charity event this weekend hosted by one of the board members. It would be a good opportunity for us to solidify their trust." Claire raised an eyebrow, her exhaustion palpable. "Another event? Don't these people ever take a break?" Ethan chuckled, the sound rare but genuine. "It's the price of keeping up appearances." Claire sighed, setting her glass down. "Fine, but this time I'm choosing my own dress." "Deal," Ethan said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The next day, Claire was flipping through a magazine at the dining table when the penthouse intercom buzzed. She frowned, unsure who it could be, as Ethan was at the office. When she answered, the receptionist downstairs informed her that Vivian Monroe was requesting to see her. Claire's stomach churned as she debated refusing the visit, but she knew Vivian wouldn't back down, and avoiding her would only make matters worse. Minutes later, Vivian stepped into the penthouse, her presence as commanding as ever. She surveyed the room with her usual air of superiority before settling onto the pristine white couch. "I assume Ethan isn't here," Vivian said, her tone clipped. "No, he's at work," Claire replied, keeping her voice neutral. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Monroe?" Vivian crossed her legs elegantly, her sharp gaze landing on Claire. "I came to offer you some advice." Claire folded her arms, bracing herself. "I'm listening." "You've managed to convince some of Ethan's associates that you belong in his life," Vivian began, her words cutting. "But I see through you. You're playing a role, and while it may serve its purpose for now, don't fool yourself into thinking it's permanent." Claire's jaw tightened, but she refused to let Vivian see her falter. "You don't know me, Mrs. Monroe. You've decided who I am based on your own assumptions, but that doesn't make them true." Vivian's smile was thin, almost pitying. "You're bold. I'll give you that. But boldness won't protect you when this falls apart." Claire took a step closer, her voice steady despite the fire in her chest. "Maybe not. But I'm not here for your approval, and I don't need your protection. If you have a problem with me, take it up with your son." Vivian's eyes narrowed, but she stood gracefully, her expression unreadable. "You're braver than I expected, Claire. Let's hope it serves you well." As the door closed behind her, Claire released a shaky breath. Her heart was pounding, but a small part of her felt triumphant. She hadn't backed down, and for once she felt like she was standing her ground. Saturday arrived with all the chaos Claire had come to associate with Ethan's world. The event was held in a grand ballroom at a historic hotel, its gilded ceilings and crystal chandeliers radiating opulence. Ethan guided Claire through the crowd, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The gesture, though practiced, felt oddly comforting. As they mingled, Claire noticed how effortlessly Ethan navigated the room. His charm was disarming, his confidence magnetic. But she also saw something beneath the polished exterior, a flicker of weariness, as though the performance was wearing on him as much as it was on her. "Ethan," a voice called, drawing their attention. Howard Green, the board member who had questioned Claire at the previous meeting, approached with a warm smile. "And Claire, it's good to see you again." "Mr. Green," Claire said, returning the smile. "It's a pleasure." Howard chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "Please call me Howard. You made quite an impression at the meeting." "Did I?" Claire asked, her tone light but genuine. "Indeed," Howard said. "Ethan's always been brilliant, but your perspective added something human to the discussion. It's refreshing." Claire glanced at Ethan, whose expression was unreadable. "Thank you, Howard. That means a lot." Later in the evening, as the band played a slow melody, Ethan extended his hand to Claire. "Dance with me." Claire hesitated, the weight of the evening pressing on her, but something in his eyes, a rare vulnerability, made her take his hand. As they moved across the dance floor, Claire felt the tension between them shift. The closeness was disarming, the rhythm of the music pulling them into a moment that felt strangely real. "You're different tonight," Claire said softly, her eyes searching his. "So are you," Ethan replied, his voice equally quiet. Claire's heart raced as she realized how easily they were slipping into something that felt less like an act and more like the truth. But before she could process the moment, the spell was broken by a familiar voice. "Well, isn't this charming?" Chloe said, her tone dripping with sarcasm as she approached. The tension snapped back into place, and Claire stepped away from Ethan, her defenses rising once more. The soft hum of the city below the penthouse's windows was a stark contrast to the storm of emotions that swirled inside Claire's chest. She stood by the window, gazing out at the skyline, her thoughts tangled in the threads of the evening. The charity event had been a turning point, one where the delicate balance she had been trying so hard to maintain seemed to shift. For a brief moment, she had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, her connection with Ethan was becoming real. But Chloe's interruption, her biting remarks, had brought everything back into focus. Claire had been playing a role, and no matter how much Ethan's touch lingered on her skin, no matter how convincing the facade seemed to others, she couldn't forget the truth. Later that night, Claire found herself alone in the guest room, her fingers tracing the edges of the delicate sheets. The grand, impersonal space felt distant, a far cry from the cramped but familiar quarters she had once shared with Sam. The clink of glass against stone drifted from the kitchen, followed by the sound of footsteps. "Ethan?" Claire turned as he entered the room, his tie now gone and sleeves rolled up, his expression still composed, but more relaxed than it had been during the evening. He stood at the threshold, watching her, his gaze unreadable. "You've been quiet since the gala," Ethan observed, his tone low. Claire straightened, her emotions still raw. "I'm just tired," she said, her voice thick with the unspoken thoughts she couldn't yet articulate. Ethan's expression softened slightly, though there was a faint line of concern in his forehead. "What's bothering you? It's not the event, is it?" "Not entirely," Claire replied, her voice quieter now. "It's everything. This whole arrangement." She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "I feel like I'm losing myself in it. I'm just a pawn in your game, Ethan. A means to an end." Ethan's jaw tightened at her words, and for a moment he said nothing. He crossed the room slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. When he reached her, he stopped just short of touching her, his presence commanding yet careful. "You're not just a pawn," he said, his voice steady but laced with something softer. "You're not playing a role for me. You're real. All of it, Claire. The way you speak your mind, the way you challenge me. It's not something I can just ignore." Claire looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. Was he being sincere? Or was this just another part of the act, one she was too afraid to see through? The silence between them hung in the air, thick and heavy. Finally, Claire spoke, her voice a mixture of vulnerability and disbelief. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, pretending, for you, for everyone. I want more than this, Ethan. I need to know that what's between us is real, that I'm not just a part of your strategy." Ethan's expression faltered for a moment, his facade cracking just enough for Claire to see the struggle behind his calm exterior. "I don't know what it is between us either," he admitted, his voice softer now. "But I do know that what we've built, it's not just business, it's more. I care about you, Claire." The words hung in the air like a confession, raw and unexpected. Claire's heart skipped a beat, but she couldn't bring herself to trust them completely. The fear of disappointment, of being let down again, was a constant weight on her shoulders. "I can't do this unless I know you mean it, Ethan," Claire whispered, stepping back from him, her hands trembling. "I can't live in the shadows of your expectations. I need something real." Ethan's eyes softened, his gaze full of regret and longing. "I want that too, but I don't know how to give it to you, Claire. Not yet, but I'm willing to try." The next morning, the tension of the previous night still lingered in the air. Claire sat at the kitchen table, sipping her coffee slowly, lost in thought. The quiet was interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell, startling her from her reverie. She hesitated for a moment, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. When she opened the door, her heart sank. Vivian Munro stood on the threshold, as composed and poised as ever, her eyes scanning Claire with the same critical gaze she had worn since their first meeting. Behind her, a sleek black car idled in the street, its tinted windows hiding the identity of the driver. "I thought I'd pay you a visit," Vivian said, her tone as cold and calculated as Claire had come to expect. Claire swallowed, trying to remain composed. "What brings you here, Mrs. Munro?" Vivian stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her gaze sweeping over the penthouse as though she were inspecting a piece of fine art. "I think we need to have a conversation, you and I." Vivian led Claire into the living room, where they both took a seat. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Finally, Vivian spoke, her voice smooth but laced with underlying menace. "You're playing a dangerous game, Claire," Vivian said, her tone almost pleasant. "This marriage, this charade you're putting on, it won't last. Ethan may be naive enough to think he can have it both ways, but I'm not. I've seen too many people like you, using whatever charm you can to get what you want." Claire's heart beat faster, but she refused to let Vivian see her fear. "I'm not using anyone, Mrs. Munro. I'm doing what I have to do, what Ethan and I agreed to." Vivian's eyes narrowed, a smile playing at the edges of her lips. "Don't mistake my tolerance for approval. I know what you're really after. You're not fooling me." Claire stood up, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "You're wrong. I'm not after anything other than what's best for my family. This deal, this marriage, it was never about me trying to take Ethan's place. It's about survival." Vivian's laugh was sharp, her eyes gleaming with disdain. "Survival, huh? Don't make the mistake of thinking Ethan needs saving, Claire. He's far more capable than you think." Claire met her gaze, refusing to back down. "I never said he wasn't capable, but he's not infallible, neither am I, but we're trying." Vivian stood, her heels clicking on the floor as she walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back to Claire with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We'll see how long this lasts, but don't say I didn't warn you." Claire stood in the quiet of the living room long after Vivian had left. The words were still echoing in her head, but she refused to let them control her. She had made a choice, and that choice was hers to live with. For better or worse. Ethan entered a few moments later, his expression unreadable. How did it go? Claire swallowed, looking away. "She thinks I'm trying to take you for everything you've got." Ethan's face hardened, but he said nothing. Instead, he stepped toward Claire, his presence more solid than usual. She doesn't get to decide what happens between us. We do. Claire met his gaze, her heart pounding. But what is between us, Ethan? What happens when the contract ends? Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing hers. I don't know the answer to that, Claire, but I'm not letting you go without a fight. The days following Vivian's visit passed in a blur of tension. Claire's heart was still heavy from the words spoken, but she held on to the fragile hope that her bond with Ethan could grow into something real. She had agreed to this arrangement, yes, but she wasn't blind to the cracks that were beginning to form, both in their marriage and in her own heart. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the tension finally reached its breaking point. The sun streamed through the penthouse windows, casting warm golden rays across the room. Claire was seated on the couch, staring blankly at the stack of papers in front of her. The contract, the merger details, all the things she had carefully avoided thinking about for weeks. Ethan entered the room, his phone in hand, his face unreadable. He paused when he saw Claire, her distant expression marking a shift in the air between them. Something was different, something deeper. He hadn't seen Claire like this before, not in the controlled way she had been, not in the quiet strength she'd shown in front of others. This felt more like a crack in her armor, a moment of raw vulnerability. He cleared his throat, stepping closer. Hey, what's going on? Claire didn't look up immediately. She traced a finger along the edge of the contract, her thoughts swirling. I've been thinking, she started, her voice soft but steady, about this, about us. Ethan sat beside her, the concern in his eyes palpable. What do you mean? Claire finally met his gaze, her expression heavy with emotion. This contract, the role we've been playing, I'm starting to wonder if it's even worth it. Are we really building something, Ethan? Or are we just passing time? The silence between them felt like 1,000 miles, each word and hesitation weighing heavily on her. Ethan swallowed, the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't prepared for this conversation, for the vulnerability that Claire was offering so openly. His thoughts raced. He had worked so hard to keep everything under control, to keep the arrangement simple and businesslike. But he couldn't ignore the stirring in his chest, the undeniable truth that Claire was more than just a pawn in his plan. I don't know, he admitted, his voice low. I want to believe we're building something, Claire. But the more I think about it, the more I realize I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know what we are. The weight of his admission lingered between them. Claire's heart began to pound in her chest as the words sank in. She had asked for honesty, but now that it was here, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Her fingers tightened on the contract, her grip almost painfully tight. So, what happens now? She asked, her voice a whisper. We keep pretending? We keep going through the motions? Ethan shook his head, his expression conflicted. I don't want to pretend. I never wanted to, Claire. But we both know there's more at stake here than just us. There's the merger, the business, my family. I get it, Claire said, cutting him off. You have obligations, things you can't walk away from. I understand that. But where does that leave me, Ethan? Where do we stand in all this? Her words hit him like a blow to the gut. The reality of it all, his ambition, his need for success, had clouded everything. He had pushed aside their growing connection, compartmentalized it as something that could wait until the right time. But now, there was no denying it. Claire had become more than just a contract, more than just a business deal. The truth crashed over him, and in that moment, Ethan realized how much he had taken Claire's presence for granted. I don't know how to answer that, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been so focused on what I need that I didn't stop to think about what you need, what we both need. Just then, the sharp ring of the doorbell echoed through the apartment, interrupting their fragile moment of understanding. Claire stood abruptly, her feet moving faster than her mind could catch up. She opened the door to find Chloe standing there, her eyes calculating, her lips curved into a polite but empty smile. "Claire," Chloe said, her voice dripping with insincerity, "we need to talk." Claire's stomach twisted with a mixture of irritation and dread. She had no desire to entertain Chloe's games, especially not when her thoughts were already clouded by doubt and confusion. Now is not a good time. "Oh, I think it is," Chloe insisted, pushing her way past Claire and into the penthouse, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "You've been playing the doting wife for far too long. It's time you realize that you aren't the one calling the shots here." Claire stepped back, her heart racing. "What are you talking about?" Chloe's smile widened as she crossed her arms, sizing Claire up. "You think this is a love story, don't you? You think Ethan's fallen for you. Well, let me tell you something. This marriage, this arrangement, it's all about appearances. Nothing more. Ethan's always been driven by business, by power. You're just the latest pawn in his game." Claire stood frozen, the weight of Chloe's words hitting harder than she expected. The painful truth gnawed at her insides as the pieces began to fall into place. She had known, on some level, that she was never truly part of Ethan's world, that she was playing a role to secure his future. But hearing Chloe confirm it felt like the final blow. She turned to Ethan, who had been silent throughout Chloe's tirade. His expression was unreadable, his face a mask of control, but Claire could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Ethan," Claire said, her voice trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. "Is this true?" Ethan's gaze flicked between Chloe and Claire, the internal battle playing out on his face. For a moment, Claire thought he might deny it, tell her it wasn't like that Chloe was wrong. But when he spoke, his voice was thick with regret. "Claire, I never meant for you to get hurt," Ethan said, his voice strained. "But Chloe's right. This deal, this arrangement, it was about saving my company, securing my future. I never thought about how it would affect you." The air between them grew heavier, suffocating as Claire's worst fears were confirmed. She had become a tool, a stepping stone in Ethan's pursuit of power. The man she had allowed herself to trust, to care for, had never truly let her in. "I can't do this," Claire said, her voice steady but breaking beneath the surface. She took a step back, her heart heavy with the finality of her words. "I can't be a part of your game anymore, Ethan. I can't pretend." Before Ethan could respond, Claire turned and walked away, each step taking her further from the man she had thought she could trust. The door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the silence of the penthouse. Outside, the city lights blurred in the distance, and Claire's chest tightened with the weight of her decision. She had chosen to walk away, not just from Ethan, but from the illusion of the life she had hoped for. She didn't know what came next, but she was done being someone else's pawn. Weeks passed, and Claire's life slowly returned to its original rhythm. The diner, though still struggling, was hers again. She fought every day to keep it alive, each small victory a reminder of her strength. And though Ethan never reached out after that night, Claire found solace in knowing that she could stand on her own. In the end, the marriage, the contract, had been a fleeting moment, a painful chapter that taught her the value of authenticity, of standing firm in who she truly was. Claire Bennett was no longer just surviving, she was living. The twists and turns of Claire and Ethan's journey remind us that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the most meaningful discoveries. What started as a business arrangement transformed into something neither of them could have predicted, proof that even in the most calculated relationships, authenticity and connection can still thrive. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future stories filled with drama, love, and unforgettable moments. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.